Welcome. I am Ms.N.S.Lavanya, Assistant Professor, Department of English, KCS Kasinadar College of Arts and Science. In this video, you are going to learn the summary of Garden Party written by Katherine Mansfield. It is a 1922 short story. It was first published in 3 parts. Its luxurious setting is based on Mansfield's childhood home at 133 Chinnacory Road, the second of 3 houses in Thorndon, Wellington, that her family lived in. The text is written in the modernist mode without a set structure and with many shifts in the narrative. Mansfield was seen one of the prime innovators of the short story form. Let's see the characters one by one. Laurie Sheridan. The story's curious and free-spirited protagonist. She is Mr. and Mrs. Sheridan's teenage daughter and sister to Laurie, Josh and Meg. Next is Meg Sheridan. Neither of Laura's siblings, Meg is a relatively minor character and does not speak in the story. Like the rest of her family, Meg is depicted as living a leisurely life. Josh Sheridan. She is Laura's forceful, practical and confident sister who enjoys ordering around her siblings and the family's servants. Laurie Sheridan. Mrs. Sheridan, Laura's domineering and passive-aggressive socialite mother. Next one is Laurie Sheridan. He is Laura's brother, confident and character foil. He is close to Laura in age but behaves in an exceedingly formal way. Kitty Maitland. She is the only named guest who attends the garden party, but the story does not include any information about who she is. Sheridan's cook has a much more forceful presence than the other servants. On the morning of the garden party, she insists that she is terrified of the cook. There are 2 servants in the house. Good little Hans is a servant in the Sheridan house and does not speak in the story. The servant, Sadie, is primarily a messenger. M is Scott's wife and mother to their 5 children. After his death, she is left without a livelihood. She is always crying. M. Scott's sister greets Laura upon her arrival at Scott's house. Laura is terrified both of the poor people who live in the cottages because she is very poor. Mr. Sheridan, the family's patriarch, only appears twice in the story. He goes to the office with Laura and later mentions Scott's death in Marquee after the party. The delivery man for Godbey's famous cream puff shop is the one who first tells Sadie, Hans and the Sheridan family about Mr. Scott's accidental death. The florist man delivers trays and trays of bright pink canna lilies to the Sheridan's house on the morning of the garden party. Another important character, Mr. Scott, is a poor horse-drawn cart operator who lives at the bottom of the hill with his wife M and 5 children. He is thrown out of his cart and killed the morning of the Sheridan's party. Here we go to the summary. On a beautiful summer morning, the Sheridan's family's gardener manicures their property in preparation for their garden party. Later that day, as Mrs. Sheridan eats breakfast with at least 2 of her daughters, Meg and Laura, 4 workmen come to assemble the marquee, which means a large outdoor tent. Mrs. Sheridan insists that one of the children must decide where it should go and supervise the workers. She sends Laura, the artistic one, to do so. Laura is delighted to have this responsibility and heads outside with a breakfast of bread and butter. She meets the 4 workmen and is impressed by their tools. She approaches them nervously and tries to greet them as a mother would. Instead, she cannot find the right words and stutters, "Oh, have you come it about the marquee?" When one of the workmen smiles and answers warmly in the affirmative, Laura is relieved at his friendliness. Laura suggests they set up the marquee on the lily lawn. The workman disagrees, suggesting the marquee should go somewhere more obvious, where it can give you a bang slap in the eye. The narrator tells readers that Laura did quite follow the workman. She suggests the corner of the tennis court, but the workman thinks it would make more sense to put the band in front of the beautiful caraca trees. The narrator describes them in detail and wonders, must they be hidden by a marquee? The narrator answers her own question, they must. The workmen have already started assembling the marquee, and Laura's worries evaporate when she is surprised to see one of them bend down and sniff a lavender plant. Deciding she prefers the extraordinarily nice workmen to the silly boys from her own social class that she generally dances and dines with. She laments the absurd class divisions that separate wealthy from working people. One of the men calls out, "Are you right there, Mattie?" Laura smiles back, eats her bread and butter, and tries to signal her joy, feeling just like a work girl. Someone inside yells that Laura has a telephone call. She runs inside and encounters Mr. Sheridan and her brother Laurie, who asks her to see if his coat needs to be ironed. She gives him a hug and remarks how much she loves parties before heading to the telephone. Laura answers the call from Kitty Maitland and, again imitating her mother's voice, invites her over for lunch before the party. Mrs. Sheridan yells from upstairs for Kitty to wear that sweet hat you had on last Sunday. Laura relays the message, hangs up, and notices the subtle signs of activity in the house. The sound of workers moving the piano and the feeling of little faint winds blowing around the room. The doorbell rings. Sadie, one of the Sheridan's domestic servants, answers it. Laura joins her to find that the florist has come with trays and trays full of beautiful pink canna lilies. Laura moans as she moves closer to warm herself at that blaze of lilies, which she feels in her fingers, on her lips, growing in her breast. She concludes that it must have been a mistake for the florist to send so many. Mrs. Sheridan walks in and affirms that she ordered them herself after seeing them in the florist's shop window the day before and deciding that for once in my life I shall have enough canna lilies. Laura complains that her mother had promised not to interfere with the party planning, but her mother reprimands her and instructs the florist to deliver a man where to put the lilies as he carries them inside. In the drawing room, hence, a servant, Meg and Josh, two of other Sheridan daughters, have finished moving the piano. Josh tells Hans to rearrange the room. Ordering around the servants is her greatest pleasure. She tells Meg to play the piano so she can practice in case she has to sing at the party. Laura and Mrs. Sheridan enter the room as Josh begins to sing a tragic song called "The Life is Weary." During the most sorrowful part of the song, Josh suddenly puts on a brilliant, dreadfully unsympathetic smile and asks Mrs. Sheridan, "Aren't I in good voice, Mummy?" before finishing the song. Sadie interrupts to tell Mrs. Sheridan that the cook needs the flags for the sandwiches. Mrs. Sheridan says she will let her have them in 10 minutes, but the children can tell that their mother doesn't have them yet. Mrs. Sheridan tells Meg and Josh to finish getting dressed and tells Laura to write the names on the flags for her. Mrs. Sheridan also asks Josh to pacify the cook, of whom she admits she is terrified. After finding the envelope with the names behind the dining room clock, Mrs. Sheridan accuses the children of stealing and hiding it. She reads off the sandwich names: cream cheese and lemon curd, then egg and olive, which she misreads as mice. Next, Laura brings the sandwich flags to the kitchen where Josh congratulates the cook on the 15 different kinds of sandwiches she has made. The cook simply smiles. From the pantry, Sadie announces that Godber's man has arrived with Godber's famous cream puffs. Cook orders Sadie to bring them inside and then begins arranging them for the party, including shaking off the excess icing sugar. Laura remarks that they remind her of the Sheridans' past parties, and Josh reluctantly agrees. Cook tells the girls to each take one, and while they realize it is improper to have fancy cream puffs so soon after breakfast, they nevertheless eat them in a hurry. Laura decides to head back to the garden to check on the workmen. On her way outside, Laura encounters Godber's man, excitedly telling a story to Sadie, Hans and the cook, who looks horrified. Godber's man tells Laura with relish that Scott, a cart driver who lives in a cottage down the hill, has died in a horrible accident, leaving his wife and 5 children to fend for themselves. Laura is astonished at the news and brings Josh aside to figure out how they are going to stop the party. Josh finds the suggestion that they cancel it for the Scots' sake absurd and extravagant, and the narrator explains why. The lane of decrepit cottages at the bottom of the hill, just across the road from the Sheridan's house, are home to impoverished working families. The narrator proclaims that they were the greatest possible eyesore and they had no right to be in that neighborhood at all. Sheridan children are not allowed to go there, but Laura and Laurie still like to explore the area because one must go everywhere, one must see everything. Josh claims she feels sympathy for Scott, but complains that if you are going to stop a band playing every time someone has an accident, you will lead a very strenuous life. She then accuses Scott of being drunk. This infuriates Laura, who runs upstairs to tell her mother. To Laura's astonishment, once Mrs. Sheridan realizes the death was not in the garden, she has no more sympathy for the Scotts than Josh does. She is amused, suggesting that the Sheridans have no reason to worry about the Scotts. In fact, Mrs. Sheridan suggests that the true accident was merely their hearing about Scott's death. Suddenly, Mrs. Sheridan puts her hat on Laura's head and tells her she looks such a picture offering a hand mirror. Laura refuses to be distracted, but Mrs. Sheridan, running out of patience, calls her daughter unsympathetic for planning to spoil everybody's enjoyment at the party. Laura storms out and heads to her own bedroom, where she accidentally glimpses herself in the mirror wearing her mother's hat. She is surprised by how charming she looks and begins to change her mind about stopping the party. She thinks of Mr. Scott's family, but suddenly it feels blurred and real, like a picture in the newspaper. She decides to forget about it until after the party and goes to lunch. After lunch, the band sets up in the corner of the tennis court, and Kitty Maitland remarks that they look like frogs in their green outfits. Laurie returns from the office and heads inside to get dressed. Laura suddenly remembers Scott and heads inside to ask his opinion, but decides not to mention it when he compliments her hat. Party begins. Guests arrive, stroll around the garden and compliment Laura, who glows with joy and helps greet the attendees. She asks her father if the band can get drinks. Suddenly, the party is over and Laura and Mrs. Sheridan bid the guests goodbye. Mrs. Sheridan declares the party successful, but she complains that she is exhausted because her children always insist on giving parties. The family convenes in the marquee. Mr. Sheridan brings about Scott's death, about which he heard from another source. Mrs. Sheridan complains that Laura wanted to stop the party. Mr. Sheridan laments the tragic accident which the narrator finds tactless. Mrs. Sheridan has nothing to say. Then she has one of her brilliant ideas and decides to send the leftover food from the party in a basket for that poor creature and his family. Laura questions her idea but goes along with it, fetching the basket which her mother then fills with food. Mrs. Sheridan tries to send Laura with some arum lilies too, because people of that class are so impressed by arum lilies, but takes them back when Josh remarks that their stems might damage Laura's clothes. Finally, Mrs. Sheridan calls out, "Don't on any account," but declines to finish her sentence, deciding inside to not put such ideas into the child's head. As the sun begins to set, Laura leaves the garden and starts down the road, but all she can think about is the successful party. Once Laura gets to the cottages, she suddenly notices how much her clothing stands out and worries that the residents are staring. She decides it was a mistake to have come. She knew along it was a mistake, but since she is already at the Scott's house, which has a dark knot of people congregating outside, it's too late to go back. The crowd quiets down and confirms that the house is indeed the Scott's. Laura anxiously knocks, wishing she could just leave, and decides to drop the basket and go. Suddenly, the door opens and a woman tells Laura to come in against her protest. Throughout, Laura continues to stutter and is left unable to fully express her desire to leave the basket. The woman who opened the door introduces Laura to her sister, M, who is crying and looks as though she doesn't understand why Laura is there. Laura tries to run back out the front door but stumbles into the room where Scott's body lies. M's sister figures that Laura wants to have a look at him and removes the sheet that covers the body. Laura is overcome with a sense of tranquility at the sight of Scott's dead body. She sees him as sleeping, given up to his dream, far beyond the niceties of garden parties and baskets and lace frocks. Despite marveling at the body, however, she realizes that all the same you had to cry and lets out a large childish sob. She feels she has to say something and blurts out, "Forgive my hat," before letting herself out of the Scott's house. Laura walks past the rest of the cottages where she encounters Laurie on the road that separates the rich from the poor in their neighborhood. Laurie says that the mother was worried and tries to comfort Laura as she cries. He assumes the visit must have been awful, but Laura replies that it was marvelous. She begins, "Isn't life?" but cannot bring herself to finish the idea. But no matter, the narrator tells us he quite understood. The story ends with Laurie's reply, "Isn't it, darling?" Thus we come to the end of this story. Thanks for watching this video. We meet again in the next video.